Hello, dear listener. Welcome in. There is no need to do anything just now. No place to be. No task to finish before the lamp goes out. The evening is already here, soft and a little blue at the edges, and you have done enough today. Settle yourself wherever you are most comfortable. Let the pillow take the small weight of your head. Let your shoulders fall just a little away from your ears. Let your hands open. The room around you is calm. The blanket is calm. Your breath is calm, almost without you having to ask it. Take one slow breath in and a slower one out, and another. Feel how the second one lands a little deeper than the first. There is nothing here you need to hold, nothing you need to remember, nothing pulling at the edge of your attention. Tonight you are simply going to drift, and a quiet voice will keep you company while you do. We are going to step, very gently, into a place that is not your own evening. We are going to walk into a year you have never seen. The year is 1250. The country is England. Around a small grey city on a brown river, a city that one day will be called London, but is not yet quite that. There is a soft ring of villages and hamlets and church-owned fields. Some of them are a long walk east, on the bishop's marshy land near the Thames. Some are on a high heath to the north, where monks keep their sheep. Some are south of the river, in a hamlet whose name means a stream where cranes once nested. They have wooden churches and stone churches and thatched cottages and small wells and one mill on a winding stream. They are not a story, they are a feeling. The feeling of an English village at the soft edge of medieval London on an ordinary night. We are going to drift through that ring of villages, very slowly, for a long time. We will not stay in one. We will move from a hayfield to a barn to a low fire to a small wooden saint above a door. Nothing will happen quickly. Nothing will happen sharply. There is no story you have to follow. There is nothing you have to hold in mind. The village does not need you to be awake. It only asks you to settle and to listen and to let the bells of a far-off city carry you under into a long, quiet, deep rest. Before we go any further, let us let the morning begin. The night you and I are drifting toward is still hours away. First a quiet dawn, first the slow, almost surprised waking of the small ring of villages around medieval London on a damp blue morning in the year 1250. Picture the air just before sunrise, lying thin and cool over the hayfields. Picture the dew settled on the long grass, on the leather of a leaning rake, on the woven hurdles of a sheep pen, and picture the sound that in this world is always the first thing to reach a village, a bell. Far away, behind the line of low chalk hills, there is a city. It is not yet the great roaring London of later centuries. It is a small grey-walled place on a brown river, full of wooden wharves and tile roofs and quiet bishops' palaces. But it has bells, and it has more bells than any other place within a long day's walk. The bell of the Cathedral of St. Paul, set high on its hill within the city walls. The bell of the Abbey at Westminster just upstream. The smaller bells of the great parish churches gathered along the river on a still morning when the wind has dropped and the fields are quiet. Those bells carry. They carry across the marshes east of the city, where a village stands on the bishop's land. They carry up the slope to the high heath in the north, where the monks keep their flocks. They carry across the south river meadows, where a hamlet sits beside a stream that cranes once nested in. The villager waking in the byre, or the one already up to fetch water, hears them as a faint silver thread against the larger silence of the country, and knows the city is still there. It is a strange thing to remember while you drift, that the village around medieval London was not far from London at all. A boy of 10 might walk to the city wall in a morning and be home for the evening pottage, yet the world inside the village was its own. The fields had their own names. The stream had its own moods. The lord, in the case of one of these eastern villages, was not even a baron. He was the bishop of the city itself, the man who held the manor of Stepney, on the bishop's land just east of the great gate at Aldgate, was the Bishop of London. The villager paying his rent paid it, in a sense, to a man who said Mass. North of the city, the picture was different again. The whole of Hampstead and the whole of Battersea, on either side of the river, did not belong to the king. They had been given long ago, in the year 986, by the unsteady king they later called Athelred the Unready, to the abbey at Westminster. The monks of that abbey owned the fields, the wood, the wells, the sheep, and in a quiet, gentle, distant way the people who worked them. A peasant on the North Heath in the year 1250 might never see his abbot in his life, but every blade of grass under his foot had been the abbey's for nearly 300 years. This is one of the things a modern listener does not always picture. In our minds, when we think of an English village, we imagine the squire in his manor house, the lord on his horse, the local family that has owned the land for centuries. But around medieval London in the 13th century, the lord was very often a bishop or an abbot or a great monastery, and his hand on the village was the soft, steady, quiet hand of the church. You walked on church land. You ate from church land. You died and were buried in church ground, by a priest paid by the same body that owned the field beside you. Let the dawn warm the cottage walls, just a little. The thatch is grey gold. The wattle and daub is pale, washed in a thin coat of lime. A door creaks open. Somebody steps out into the yard with a wooden bucket. The hens, who have slept in the rafters, drop down and begin scratching at the dust by the threshold. Somewhere in the byre at the far end of the long house, a cow shifts her weight against the partition. The smoke that has been seeping all night from a hole in the roof now thins, almost vanishes, as the small fire on the clay hearth is fed a single dry stick, and far away beyond the rim of the world, the bell of the city. Listen for it. 2 slow notes, then 3, then silence, then again. Nobody in the village stops to count. They simply notice that the day has been opened somewhere by another hand, and they fall in with it. The bell that mattered most to a villager was not, strangely, the morning bell. It was the evening bell. We will return to it later when the night closes in. But it has a name worth knowing, and a meaning worth turning over slowly, even at dawn. The English word curfew comes from the old French phrase couvre-feu, cover the fire. When the bell rang at dusk, at 8 or 9 in the evening, You covered the embers on the hearth with an iron lid shaped almost like a small round shield, and you went inside and you closed the door. The conqueror, William, had ordered it of every village in the year 1068, 2 years after Hastings. 2 centuries later, in the year of our drift, the order was still law. The village around London at curfew raked its ashes. The village around London at curfew became a quiet, dark, single, slowly cooling building, and if you were caught outside walking the lanes at that hour with no lantern in your hand and no honest reason in your mouth, the law had a name for you. It called you a communist noctivagus, a common night wanderer. It is not a phrase you would use about yourself. It is a phrase the manor court used about somebody else, somebody to be questioned, perhaps fined, perhaps locked up till the morning. It tells you something about the medieval village near medieval London. It tells you that to be out of doors after dark, alone, was a thing that was not assumed. The night belonged to the parish, and the parish was inside. It is worth pausing on those bells for a moment, because they are the strangest soundtrack to a medieval morning a modern listener could imagine. The largest of them was the bell of the Cathedral of St. Paul, which already in 1250 was a vast Norman building whose bell tower stood high on Ludgate Hill above the Thames. Then there was the bell of the Abbey at Westminster, just a little upstream of the city walls, ringing for the monks at every hour of the day and night. And there was the bell of the Priory of St. Mary Spittal, just outside Bishopsgate, and the bells of Bow and St. Bride, and a dozen smaller parishes besides. On a still morning, when the wind came off the river and knocked down it, the sound of 3 or 4 of these bells could overlap and unfold across the marshes and the heath like a slow soft cloth. The villager learned to read it in the way you learn to read the difference between rain and wind on a roof. He knew which bell was which. He knew, sometimes without thinking, what hour of the morning office of prime had reached the abbey, and whether the cathedral had begun its own. Time in the medieval village around London was not a number. Time was a sound. There is a second small thing about Stepney, the village on the bishop's marshy land east of the city, that is worth knowing while the morning settles. Its parish church, the church of St. Dunstan and All Saints, was already 300 years old in the year of our drift. It had been refounded around the year 952 by St. Dunstan himself, who was, as it happens, the Bishop of London at the time. The church still stands today on the same low rise, and a small detail of the building from this very century has survived all the centuries since. In the south wall of the chancel, set into the stone, is a row of 3 arched stone seats, a triple sedilia, for the priest and the deacon and the subdeacon at Mass. They were carved in the 13th century. They are almost certainly what a villager in our drifting year would have looked at with sleepy eyes during a long Sunday office. The bishop who held the lordship of the manor outside, and the priest who said Mass inside on the bishop's bench, were not in any real sense 2 different worlds. For now, though, the morning is still climbing. The bell of the city has stopped. A sparrow lands on the byre roof and tries the thatch. The villager fills his bucket from the wooden well, lifts it onto his shoulder, and walks across the dew-grey yard toward the open door of the cottage. The pottage pot is already on the hook above the fire. Today is just one day among many. He will not call it special. The bell from the city will ring again at dusk, and again at dawn the next morning, and on all the dawns after that. The villager is 43 years old. He has heard the same bell from the same direction on perhaps 15,000 mornings of his life. He will hear it on perhaps another 4,000 mornings before he is buried in the parish ground a few yards from the door of the church. His father heard the same bell. His grandfather heard the same bell. 3 of his children who did not live to walk were buried within earshot of it. 2 more who did are still asleep in the cottage behind him as he walks out into the cool morning. The bell will go on ringing after he is gone, in the soft, unbroken way bells do. And think, just for a moment longer, of how different the night before this morning has been from one of yours. There were no street lamps in the lane outside. There were no glowing rectangles in any pocket. There was no wash of light from a city sky to soften the dark. The night between the curfew bell and the dawn bell had been in this village a deep, complete, almost solid black, broken only by the rushlight of a sick child and the thin glow of banked embers under the iron lid. To wake from that depth was to wake into a world where the very first thing your ears could find was a far-off bell. The bell did not arrive in a small village morning. The bell shaped it, and so as the bell faded into the morning, the village around it began the older work it had always done on land that did not quite belong to it. Stay with the village a little longer. The sun has lifted now. The dew is mostly gone from the long grass, only still beading on the shadowed side of the wooden well. The cow in the byre has been led out for the day. A child runs barefoot along the lane between the cottages, then stops to throw a small stone at nothing in particular, and walks on. And as the village steps into its morning, here is something quiet to drift on. Every footstep that child takes is on land that does not belong to her family. This is one of the surprises of the medieval village near London. The fields were owned, the wood was owned, the stream was owned, the path was in a sense owned. Even the hayfields rolling away toward the marsh were not the village's fields. They were the Lord's fields, and the Lord was very often the bishop of the city, or the monks of the abbey upstream. The villager worked them. The villager fed his family from a portion of them, but the villager did not, in the way we mean it now, own them. Think of the small village south of the river. In the great Domesday Book, written down by the clerks of King William more than 160 years before the night you are drifting through, that village was named Camberwell. A Londoner of today would call it. The clerks wrote down what they found there in 20 crisp lines of Latin abbreviation. They counted 22 villagers and 7 smallholders. They counted 6 ploughs. They counted a church. They counted 63 acres of meadow, and they counted woodland enough to feed 60 pigs in the autumn pannage. That is the whole of it. 22 villagers and 7 smallholders. A modern Londoner who hears the word Camberwell pictures a borough. The clerks of William pictured a few families and a wooden church. The little hamlet has barely grown by the year 1250, and what we call a place was then almost a name without a settlement. The field beyond that little church was not laid out the way you and I picture a field. There were no neat squares fenced with hedges. There were no farmhouses set in their own gardens. Instead, almost everywhere around medieval London, there were 2 or 3 enormous open fields, unfenced, sweeping for a furlong and another furlong and another furlong across the parish. A furlong is a beautiful unit of measure because it does not come from anywhere abstract. A furlong is the distance an ox team can pull a plough before they have to stop and breathe. About 220 yards, a little over 200 meters. The field was divided lengthways into furlongs, and the furlongs were divided crossways into long, thin, ribbon-like strips. The strips were called cellions, or ridges, and a peasant family might hold 70 of them. 70, not one farm. 70 strips, scattered across the fields, a few here, 2 there, 1 over the brow of the slope, 3 down by the wood. Their land was not in one place. Their land was a long pattern of ribbons through the great open field of the manor, and one of the 2 or 3 fields was, every year, lying fallow, left to rest under thistles and grazing sheep, so that the soil could return to itself. So a villager woke in the morning, knowing that this strip and that strip and that strip were his to plough today, and the strip beside them was somebody else's, and the strip beyond that was the priest's, and the strip after that belonged to the widow at the corner. Their lives ran like ribbons through the same cloth. You might wonder how, in a system like that, anyone managed to plant the right thing at the right time, or to keep one man's sheep out of another man's wheat. The answer was the manor court, which is the next quiet thing to drift through. Every few weeks the steward of the manor, the lord's man of business, often well-dressed, often an outsider, held court in the village. The whole settlement gathered, cases were heard, stray pigs in the demesne were fined, marriages between villages were registered, disputes over a hedge were settled, new tenants were enrolled. Ale that had been brewed too weak was charged a small penalty. Under the steward, but inside the village, was the reeve. The reeve was almost always a peasant himself, a villain, elected by his neighbours, a man who knew everybody's furrows and everybody's quarrels because he had grown up among them. He kept the daily account. He chivied the harvest. He spoke to the Lord on the village's behalf, and to the village on the Lord's behalf. He had power over his neighbours, but he ate at the same table as them on Sunday. Under the reeve was the haywood. The haywood had a softer name and a sharper job. It was his work to walk the field edges every day and find the stray cow that had pushed through a hedge, the goat that had eaten a neighbour's beans, the boy who had cut a green branch from the Lord's wood without permission. He brought offenders to the next manor court. The haywood was, in a sense, the village's small policeman, but his beat was a hedge, and above all of these little human customs, written and rewritten by generations of village clerks, sat the customer. The customer was the manor's own little book of law. Every manor had one. They were not the king's law, and not the bishop's law. They were the village's own pact, made over centuries, recorded in slow Latin, and consulted whenever a difficult case came up. They told you when you could plant. They told you what you owed at Michaelmas. They told you the fine for marrying a girl from another manor without the Lord's leave. They told you, in some places, exactly which day was hay day, on which everyone in the village had to be in the meadow with a scythe at sunrise. The costumal was the soft glue between hundreds of unspoken understandings. A modern listener might think, hearing all this, that the medieval village near London was a place of crushing rules. It was certainly a place of rules, but every rule was inside a known world. The reeve had grown up beside you. The haywood was the boy you had thrown a stone at when you were 6. The steward came twice a month and went home. The costumal was a piece of paper, but the daily working out of it was a long, quiet conversation between people who had known each other since baptism and would know each other until burial. The rules were the air you breathed. You did not ordinarily think about them. There were also the older payments, the ones that were not really fines but renders, paid in the same way every year, on the same fixed days, by everybody. There was Michaelmas, the feast of Saint Michael on the 29th of September. On Michaelmas the year's main rent was due. There was Martinmas on the 11th of November, which was the time for the slaughter of the pigs and the salting of the bacon and the smaller secondary render. There was Lammas on the 1st of August, the loaf mass, a tiny ritual where the first loaf of new wheat was brought to the church to be blessed before any of it was eaten. And there was Hocktide, in the 2nd week after Easter, where in some places the women of the village playfully roped the men of the village in the lane with a long woolen cord, and would not let them pass without a small coin for the parish. Each of these days carried its own small, slow obligation. None of them needed to be remembered, because the bell of the church reminded the village of every one of them. And then there was the tithe. The tithe was an older thing than even the manor court. It was the church's own claim, not the Lord's, on 1/10 of every parishioner's yearly produce. The great tithe was the tithe on the grain. The small tithe was the tithe on everything else: wool, lambs, calves, eggs, honey, the hen at Christmas, the goose at Michaelmas. Every village had a tithe barn, often the largest building in the parish after the church itself, where the 10th sheaf of every harvest was stored. The villagers did not, on the whole, resent the tithe. They had paid it for centuries, and their parents had paid it, and the loft of the tithe barn had always been full at this time of year. The tithe was simply the price of having a priest at the altar, a font for your child, a churchyard for your grandfather. The ribbons of the field then were also ribbons of obligation. This strip went, after the first sheaf, to the lord of the manor at Michaelmas. That strip went, by way of the great tithe, to the priest. This furlong fed the village. That furlong fed the abbey upstream. The demesne, the lord's own long ribbon running through the middle of the field, fed nobody but him. And every villager, on a soft afternoon like this, knew exactly which ribbon was which, and walked between them without thinking, the way you and I walk past a familiar shop without reading the sign above the door. There is one more soft, surprising thing to know about the medieval English manor. The land could be inherited, but only on the Lord's terms. When a villain died, His heir did not simply walk into the strips. He paid a Harriet, a death render, usually the best beast of the dead man's household, a cow very often, or, in a poorer cottage, the only good blanket. The Harriet was carried to the Lord's barn within a few days of the burial. The costumal had been clear about it for centuries. It was not a fine, it was an old understood thing, like the morning bell. The strips passed to the son, the cottage passed to the son, the obligations passed to the son, the small box of pennies under the bed passed to the son, and the best cow walked, slowly in the company of the bailiff, to the manor barn, and the village, hardly pausing, went on. The other slow surprise of the field is that almost everything in it was decided collectively: when to plough, when to sow, when to bring in the hay, when to turn the cattle into the stubble after the harvest, when to release the pigs into the wood at pannage, when to drain a wet ditch, when to mend a broken rail. None of these decisions belonged to any one peasant. They were taken year after year by the whole village together, sometimes formally at the manor court, sometimes informally in the alewife's cottage, sometimes by the reeve walking round to each cottage in turn. The villagers, in this sense, were a single soft body of 70 or 80 people, who farmed one large slow field. Their independence was small, their cooperation was very large. Far off, the bell of the city. The Hayward steps over a low hedge and stoops to mend a gap a sheep has pushed through. A cow lows mildly in a furrow. The ribbon strips of the field run away in a soft pattern, golden where the wheat is ripening, brown where the fallow lies, green where the meadow has been mown for hay. The wind moves the long grass and goes on without saying anything, and the rules in that little book were not the only thing that decided how the day was spent. Far older was the field itself. Lean a little further into the morning. The haywood has gone over the hill. Somewhere along the lane, an alewife is hanging a long ash pole over the door of her cottage to tell the village that the new ale has finished its second day of cooling and is ready to be tasted. A boy has been sent to the priest's cottage with a bowl of curd. The reeve is walking down the field edge with 2 old men, talking about a strip that was ploughed wrong last week. The medieval village near London has, this morning, a very particular shape, the shape of perhaps 80 or 100 people who have known each other since they were born. This is one of the small surprises of the place. The village around medieval London in 1250 was not the kind of village a modern listener pictures, where 1 or 2 families have lived for centuries while strangers come and go. It was a place where almost nobody came and almost nobody went. The same family had been on the same strips of the same field for 200 years. The reeve was the son of a man who had been reeve. The smith was the son of a smith. The widow at the corner was the great-granddaughter of the widow at the corner. The names in the parish register were the names of the people in the lane, and they were almost always the same names as the names in the parish register 100 years before and 100 years before that. This tight, unmoving fabric was held in place partly by the Lord, and partly by the law, and partly by simple habit. A villein, that is to say, a peasant tied to the land, could not in theory leave the manor without his lord's permission. He could not marry a woman from another village without his lord's permission. The fine paid for that marriage had a quiet old name, Merchant. The customer of each manor set the amount, sometimes a few shillings, sometimes a hen, sometimes a quarter of a sheep, depending on what the lord could be persuaded to take. It sounds harsh on a modern ear, but for the villager, it was simply the price of joining your life to a girl from over the hill, and the price was paid, and life went on. If you walked through the lane and asked the names of the people you met, you would notice a soft, almost playful thing. Most of them had two names, the saint's name they had been given at baptism, and a nickname tied to where you found them. John o' the Wood, Alice at the Gate, Adam by the Stream, Robert the Smiths, Marjorie o' the Brook. The surname in the year 1250 is barely a surname at all. It is more than anything an address. It is a way of saying which John, when there are 5 Johns in a village of 80 souls. By the time of the great parish surveys 2 centuries later, those addresses will harden into family names. By our own century, those names will sit on identity cards in cities the medieval Johns never imagined. But on this morning, in the year of our drift, your second name is just the path the village takes to find you. The alewife is one of the village's quiet centres. In nearly every cottage in England, the woman of the house knew how to brew, but in some cottages she brewed more than the household could drink, and she sold the rest. The wooden door was left a little open. The long ash pole, the ale stake, went out over the lintel as a sign. The village came in 2s and 3s in the slow afternoon with a wooden mug or a leather jack, and they paid in coin or in eggs, and they sat on a bench and drank a small pale ale that was not strong enough to make them lose the day, but even she was watched. The manor had an officer called the ale taster, sometimes a small group of 2 or 3 of them, who walked the village at brewing time and sampled each new batch. They tested its strength against an agreed standard. They charged a small fine to brewers who watered the ale, and another to brewers who poured short. The medieval ale taster has perhaps the gentlest job in this whole story. He went from one house to another with a wooden cup. He sat down, he sipped, he nodded or he frowned, he moved on, and around him all of the trust in the small economy of the village quietly held together. The priest in his small thatched cottage beside the church was another knot in the same cloth. He was not, in most villages, a learned man. He was, very often, a local boy who had been picked out as a child by the parish, taught his Latin by the elder priest, and ordained by the bishop on a quiet morning at the cathedral. His Latin was not always good. It was very often a kind of half-learned chant, the way a man learns the words of a song without knowing the meaning of every line. But he could read enough to take a wedding, to christen a child, to read the Mass, to bless a sickbed, to bury the dead, and he was in many villages the only person who could write at all. When a quarrel had to be put on parchment, the priest was the man who held the quill. He lived inside the same small economy as everyone else. He had a strip in the field, like every other villager. He kept a few hens. He owed the bishop a small render every year. He drank the same small ale. He ate the same pottage. The line between him and his parishioners was a line drawn in the soft chalk of vocation, not in stone. There was one figure in the village more obscure to a modern listener, but very real to its inhabitants: the freeman. Not every villager was a villain tied to the Lord's land. Some held their land freely, paying a fixed cash rent, free to leave the manor if they chose, free to marry whom they liked, free to plead in the king's court rather than the manor court. Around medieval London, free tenancies were a little more common than further inland, because the great churches who owned much of the land had, over the years, granted small parcels at fixed rent to attract industrious tenants. So in the same lane you might find a villain and a freeman, two men whose grandfathers had been more or less the same kind of farmer, but whose legal lives now ran along slightly different rails. The villain nodded to the freeman over a hedge. The freeman raised his hat to the villain in the lane. They drank in the same alehouse, beneath the same ale-stake. They were, on this morning, indistinguishable. It is easy, drifting on the surface of a village like this, to forget how rare and beautiful and difficult it is for so many people to know each other for so long. There were quarrels in this village. There were old grudges. There were marriages that had gone cold, and tongues that had been sharpened on neighbours for 30 years. The costumal had clauses for slander, for fighting at the well, for striking the reeve. None of these people were saints, but they did not by and large walk away. They could not. They lived their whole lives in earshot of the same bell, and in among the villain and the freeman and the priest and the alewife were the smaller, quieter, almost unwritten figures of the village. The midwife, who was very often an older widow with grey hair and hands that had caught half the children in the parish over the last 40 years. She was paid in eggs and in cloth, and in a small share of the harvest. She was never named in the manor court rolls, because she did nothing the manor court needed to know about. But every cradle in the village had once rested in her arms in its first hour. The smith, who lived a little apart in a low stone and thatch forge at the bend of the lane, where the ringing of his hammer on the anvil was the steady metronome of the village morning. He shoed the Lord's horses and made the small iron tools, billhooks, sickles, ploughshares, hinges, nails, that every household needed. He was in many parishes the wealthiest peasant. The carpenter, who set the crook frames and mended the byre partitions and made the ladders and the stools and the long wooden chests. The forester, the man who walked the Lord's wood and kept the deer and the timber and the deadwood right. There was also the godparent system, which is a quiet thread running through the whole social cloth. Every child in the village had 3 godparents, gossipies, the medieval English called them, chosen by the parents from among neighbours and kin. The gossip was, in a real and unsentimental way, a second parent. If the parents died, the gossip stepped in. If the parents quarrelled, the gossip mediated. The bond between gossips lasted for life, and so every villager, as well as having a mother and a father and a wife or a husband and a small handful of brothers and sisters, also had 3 or 4 other adults in the village whose lives ran alongside their own with a soft, almost familial gravity. The village was, in this way, much more thickly woven than its small numbers suggest. And then there were the wandering visitors, the chapman, the small peddler, who came twice a year with a pack of needles and ribbons and small mirrors and a lump of salt for a household that had run out. The friar, usually a grey friar, a Franciscan, sometimes a Black Friar, a Dominican, both orders new in England in this century, who walked from village to village preaching in plain English at the cross outside the church. The minstrel who appeared at harvest with a small lute and sang the long old verses of Robin Hood and Bevis of Hampton and the Roman of Charlemagne, the pilgrim on his way to Canterbury or to Walsingham, asking for a night's straw in the byre and a plate of pottage. These were the only outsiders the village met. They came a few times a year. They went on. The village remembered each of them, and the children, of whom there were many, ran in and out of the lane in a soft, loose pack, half supervised, half feral, knowing every gap in every hedge by heart. They played at knucklebones in the dirt, a game of tossing 5 small bones into the air and catching them on the back of the hand, the great-grandfather of the modern jacks. They rolled wooden hoops down the lane with a small stick. They played at hide-and-seek in the wood at the edge of the field. They pretended to be the lord and the bailiff and the reeve. By 12 they were already working the harvest. By 15 they were considered, in many places, old enough to marry. The medieval village's childhood was short, light-footed, slightly grubby, and almost entirely outdoors, and once everyone in the parish knew their place, the long, slow work of feeding them all could begin. By now the morning has rolled into the small middle of the day. The sun is high, but only just. Smoke is rising from one cottage and the next, a thin grey scarf above each thatched ridge. Inside almost every door in the village around medieval London, the same single pot is hanging on its hook above the fire. A pot of pottage. We are going to drift, very gently, through what people ate, and how, and who controlled it. It is a softer story than you might expect. The peasant kitchen had, in many cottages, almost nothing in it. A clay hearth in the middle of the room, a black iron pot on a chain, a wooden ladle, a small clay jug for water, a wooden trencher or two. A trencher is a thick slice of stale bread used as a plate, a wooden bowl per person perhaps, a few dried herbs hanging from a beam, a bunch of onions tied to a peg, a small sack of oats, a smaller sack of dried peas, a bag of barley. That was, very often, the whole of the kitchen. There were no shelves of saucepans, there were no spice jars in a row. The single pot did almost everything. What went into that pot was pottage, the slow, patient one-pot meal of the medieval village. It is a thing that, oddly, lives on in 100 quiet ways in modern food. Soup, stew, porridge, mash. Pottage was all of those at once, and a little of none of them. A handful of dried peas thrown in early in the morning to soften, a scoop of oats or barley to thicken, whatever leek or cabbage or onion was to hand, a few wild herbs from the bank by the stream, sometimes a scrap of salted bacon, sometimes a small piece of yesterday's mutton, sometimes nothing animal at all. The pot was always there. It simmered all day. You added to it as you went. You ladled out a portion in the late morning, and another in the early evening, and the pot itself did not really empty until it had to be scrubbed. It is hard on a modern ear to understand how soothing that arrangement was. There was no menu for the day. There was no decision about what to cook. There was a pot, and the pot was hungry, and you fed it what the field had given you, and at meal times you fed it back to yourself. The smell of it sat in the cottage all day. The cottage smelled of pottage and wood smoke and damp wool, and very little else. Beside the pottage was the bread. Bread was, in 1250, the centre of the meal. A peasant ate perhaps 1.5 pounds of bread every day. The bread was dark, dense, slightly sour, made of mixed grains, sometimes mostly rye, sometimes mostly barley, sometimes a finer wheat for a feast day. It was baked, and here is the small surprise, in nearly every village around London, by a single oven, and that single oven did not belong to the family. It belonged to the Lord. In most manors, the Lord owned the only oven, just as he owned the only mill. He charged his peasants a small fee in dough or in coin to use it. The dough was kneaded at home, on a wooden board or a quiet table. It was carried, raised, in a basket on the head, to the oven by the manor barn. It was slid in on a long wooden paddle by the village's appointed baker, and it was carried home, warm, an hour later. The fee for this, the right of the Lord to control the oven, was an old one and a sometimes resented one. The manor court rolls of the period record many quiet quarrels about it, but for most villagers it was, on most days, simply how bread happened. You did not bake bread at home. You did not have an oven. You had a pot. The same was true of the mill, the single mill of the manor, and we will return to mills in their own time, because they are larger than they look, was the Lord's mill. To grind your own grain at home, between 2 stones in your kitchen, was actually a manor court offence in many places. There are records of villagers being fined for the small treachery of a hand-quern hidden in a back room. The Lord's mill took a fixed proportion of the meal as its toll, sometimes a 16th, sometimes a 13th, sometimes a 10th. The miller had a long-standing reputation throughout medieval England for taking a little more than his share. There is a saying, a miller's thumb is the heaviest thing in his hand, and it is not a kind one. But the miller's thumb was, again, simply part of the price of bread. So the bread the villager carried home, warm in its cloth, had passed through the Lord's mill, and through the Lord's oven, and was the Lord's in a sense, almost as much as it was the villager's. And yet at table in the cottage, broken between hands, dipped into the pottage, eaten with a piece of cheese or a slice of onion, it was simply bread, simply the thing the day was built around. With the bread and the pottage, almost everyone drank ale, not water. Around medieval London, where wells were sometimes brackish from the marshes and streams sometimes clouded, it was generally agreed that water was less safe than ale. The ale of the household was very weak. Small ale, table ale, perhaps 2 or 3% alcohol, often less. It was drunk by everyone in the family from the very young to the very old. Children drank it at every meal. Old men drank a small mug at noon and again at supper. Field workers drank it through the day. The boiling of the wort had partly sterilized it. The simple, slow brewing had given it a soft, faintly sweet, slightly sour taste, and it cost almost nothing to make. Mead, the honey wine of older imagination, was a feast drink and a wealthy drink, kept for weddings and great holy days. Wine, when it appeared at all, was for the priest's altar and the Lord's high table. It had to be carried in barrels from the city of Bordeaux or from the Rhineland, and it was expensive. The village's everyday drink was small ale in a wooden mug, drunk slowly, drunk often, drunk by the gallon over a week. Meals themselves were 2, sometimes 3. A morning meal of bread and a little cheese, eaten standing or while walking out to the field. A midday or early afternoon meal of pottage and bread, taken at home if you were near, or at the field edge if you had walked far. An evening meal of more pottage and the last of the bread, taken inside as the light dropped. Forks did not exist. Everybody ate with a wooden spoon and a small belt knife in their fingers. A trencher of stale bread sat under each portion of stew, soaking up the juices, and was either eaten last or, if you had eaten enough, given to the dog at the door. Meat appeared, but not as often as a modern listener might think. A small piece of bacon in the pottage, an egg from the yard, a slice of mutton on a feast day, a goose at the harvest end. Most of the protein in the medieval village around London came not from meat, but from peas and beans and oats and cheese. The diet was mostly grain and pulse, and on it the people grew. They were, by the standard of the centuries either side, neither very small nor very malnourished. They were lean, they worked hard, the pot was always there. There were softer foods than pottage and bread, of course, when the season was kind. Cheese, made all summer in a corner of the cottage from the morning's milk, set in a wooden mould, salted, pressed under a flat stone, hung in a cloth from a beam to age. The village cheese in 1250 was almost always a hard, dry, slightly sharp pressed curd made from cow's milk in the south and from sheep's milk on the heath above. Butter in summer churned in a long wooden plunger churn, shaped into pats, salted, and kept in a small cool corner of the cottage. Soft white cheese, what we would call curd cheese, eaten fresh on a piece of dark bread. There were eggs in spring and summer, almost more than the household could eat. There were apples in autumn, bruised and a little soft, baked sometimes in the embers under the iron lid. There were the wild greens of the year, fat hen, sorrel, nettle tops in spring, watercress from the stream, dandelion leaves, primrose, parsley, gathered by the children and added by handful to the pot. There were beans and peas dried and stored in stoppered jars. There were roots, turnips, parsnips, leeks, kept in a small pit in the floor, covered with straw. The medieval village garden, the small enclosed plot behind the cottage that the villagers called a croft, was a quiet, dense, careful thing. It fed in many cottages almost as much of the household as the open field did. And at the great moments of the year, the harvest end, the slaughter at Martinmas, the Lord's Christmas, there were feasts. The harvest feast was given by the Lord on the day the last sheaf was brought in. He laid out long trestle tables in the manor barn. Every villager came. There was roast goose. There was a small barrel of stronger ale than the everyday small ale. There was perhaps a pot of honey on the table, and a cheese larger than the kitchen had. There were songs, and there was once a year perhaps a little dancing under a paper lantern. The Christmas feast was smaller and more sacred but warmer in the Lord's Hall, with a Yule log on the hearth and a piece of beef that had been salted from Martinmas. These feasts mattered. They were how the manor and the village said to one another that the year had been finished and that they were still in it together. And over all of this, over the dough rising in its wicker basket, over the pottage thickening at the hearth, over the wooden mug of pale ale, over the cheese on its beam, over the long trestle of the harvest feast, was the Lord's quiet, unspoken, permanent presence. The mill, the oven, the fixed render at Michaelmas, the long ribbon strip of his demesne running through the middle of the field. He took, and the village gave, and the village ate. There was even, on the slow, long table of medieval food, the small, soft surprise of fish. Around medieval London, the rivers and ponds were full of it, and the church required it, by long custom, every Friday and on the 40-odd days of Lent. The villager did not, on those days, eat meat. He ate fish, eel, perch, salmon if he could get it, salt fish from the wharves of the city if he could not. The medieval English calendar had, in this way, more fast days than feast days. The pottage on a Friday was a green pottage of leeks and oats, with a small piece of pickled eel laid on a slice of bread beside it. And once the loaf had come back warm from the Lord's oven, the smaller lives of the village quietly went on around it. Let the afternoon settle. The pottage pot is quiet at the back of the hearth, simmering at almost nothing. The bread is on its shelf wrapped in a cloth. The villagers have gone back out into the fields, or down to the wood, or up onto the heath. And while they go, let us drift away from the main work of the village and follow the smaller, softer lives at the edges. The pigs in the wood, the hens in the rafters, the bees on the bank, the dog at the door, the children with the dead branches. It is autumn now in our drift, just for the length of this chapter. The leaves on the great oaks at the edge of the forest of Middlesex have turned the colour of the inside of an old loaf. The acorns are dropping, the beech mast is dropping, and out from every cottage in the village, late in the morning, comes a small, restless, snorting procession. Pigs, 5 or 6 of them, perhaps a dozen in a wealthier yard. They are driven by a boy or a girl with a long ash stick, down the lane, past the church, through the gate at the edge of the field, and into the wood. There they are turned loose to root, to grunt, to eat the fallen acorns and the fallen beech mast and the fallen chestnuts to their heart's content. The boy sits on a log. The pigs do their slow, noisy work. This is pannage. It is one of the oldest peasant rights in England. The Charter of the Forest, signed in 1217, only 33 years before the night you and I are drifting through, set it down in writing for free men of every parish. They were entitled to pannage, the right to send their pigs into the wood in autumn for a few weeks to fatten themselves on the year's nuts. They were entitled also to estover, the right to gather deadwood and brushwood for fuel. They were entitled also to adjustment, the right to graze livestock. They were entitled also to turbary, the right to cut peat. They were entitled also to cablish, the right to take fallen branches blown down by the wind. The charter of the forest was, in its quiet way, the law of the village's edge. It said, "The wood is the king's, but its small mercies are yours." For the pig, autumn is the great festival of the year. The acorn is the most efficient way an English oak ever found to make pork. A pig that is turned out in October on a good wood may put on as much weight in 3 weeks as it has in the previous 3 months. By the eve of St. Martin's Day, on the 11th of November, the pig is fat. By the day after St. Martin's Day, the pig is in many cottages gone. The slaughter is a careful, slightly mournful business, and the meat is salted in barrels for the long winter. The smell of salt pork drying on a beam will sit in the cottage rafters until Easter. While the pigs are in the wood, the children are also there. They are not minding the pigs alone. They are minding the year's fuel. They walk slowly along the wood paths with linen sacks and small wooden hooks, picking up dry sticks the wind has dropped, picking up bark, gathering the windfall under hazel and ash. The hooks are for pulling down dead branches that the wind has not quite finished. The sacks are heavy by evening. The whole household's winter, in many cottages, depends on what the smallest hands can carry home before the first hard frost. It is one of the soft pleasures of this story that around medieval London, on the wood's edge, almost all the work was being done by hands smaller than ours. The 8-year-old gathered fuel, the 10-year-old drove the pigs, the 12-year-old swept the threshing floor, the 5-year-old fed the hens, the 15-year-old ploughboy walked the furrow beside his father. None of this was unusual. None of this was sad. It was simply how a village fed itself. Now the village dog, a medieval village dog, was not a pedigree creature. He was a brown, rough-coated, slightly thieving mongrel, half ratter and half guard, sometimes herder, sometimes companion. He slept by the door of the cottage on a thin layer of straw. He scratched behind his ear with his back leg in the morning sun. He chased a rat under the byre wall in the afternoon. He growled at strangers in the lane. He was beloved in the gentle medieval way of being beloved without much fuss. And there is one detail about him that almost nobody now remembers, and that is worth carrying with you into sleep. In many parts of England, a medieval village dog had to wear a piece of wood tied to his collar. The wood was called a clog. Its purpose was to hang heavy enough that the dog could not run fast enough, that is, to chase the king's deer. Forest law in the great royal forests required it. In some places the law required the cutting of the dog's claws on the front feet for the same reason. The practice had a name. It was called the lawing of dogs. Even the village dog, snoring on the threshold in the afternoon sun, lived inside the long quiet pattern of the king's forest law. Even his ankles knew it. Up on the bank behind the cottages, on the south-facing slope where the sun hit longest, the bees of the village were going about their own afternoon. The hive was not a wooden box. The hive was a skep, a tall conical basket woven of straw or rushes, set on a small stone, mouth downwards, a single hole at the front. Beside it perhaps a second skep, beside that a third. Almost every cottage in England had a few. They produced two things, both important. They produced honey, which the family kept, and which sweetened bread and pottage at feast days. And they produced wax, which the family did not in most cases keep. The wax went, more often than not, to the parish church. We will return to that strange long story when we step inside the church at evening, but for now hold this picture. The medieval village's small skeps on a sunny bank, the soft hum on a still afternoon, and the slow, steady upward path of the wax that the family rendered out of those skeps, walking it in a small bundle along the lane and giving it to the priest. The candle that lit the altar at Mass was very often the wax of the bee that had hummed past your head in August, and in the rafters of the cottage, all afternoon, the hens, they had been let out at dawn to scratch in the yard. They were back now in the dim warmth of the roof, settled on a horizontal beam, eyes half closed, occasionally muttering. They laid where they pleased. They laid in the rushes by the threshold. They laid in the straw at the corner of the byre. They laid in the small wooden crate by the woodpile. Finding the eggs each morning was a child's job. The egg was a small, white, slightly warm gift, lifted carefully into a cloth bag, carried to the kitchen, set in a wooden bowl. The medieval village around London ran on eggs in a way our own kitchens, with their cardboard cartons, no longer quite remember. There was, beside the dog and the bees and the hens, the soft, slow company of the village cat. Cats had come to England with the Romans more than 1,000 years before, and by the year 1250 they had quietly settled into almost every cottage and almost every barn. They were not, in the medieval village, the indoor lap cats of our own century. They were working animals. They lived in the byre. They slept in the loft above the cattle. They kept the rats and mice out of the small grain store. They were tolerated, fed scraps, and named, sometimes, with the same affection a household named the dog. The cat moved through the village in a soft thread no human ever quite followed. It is one of the small, unrecorded lives of the parish. The geese, on the other hand, were the loudest creatures in the yard. A cottage with a small flock of geese had, at almost no cost, a working alarm. The geese set up a clamour at every fox, every stranger, every loose dog. They were also the source of the year's feathers, for the long thin quills of the priest's pen, and for the soft pillows of the wealthier households, and for the fletching of the village boys' homemade arrows. The harvest goose was the central dish at the harvest feast. The goose at Michaelmas was a small render to the Lord. Geese were companions of a noisy, slightly grumpy kind, but they were companions all the same. Down at the stream, on a slow afternoon, the village fishermen, boys mostly, and a few older men with bad knees who could no longer follow the plough, were quietly working the eddies with willow rods and a bent iron hook. The Thames and its tributaries in the year 1250 were astonishingly full of fish. Salmon ran up to Westminster every spring. Eels by the thousand came down from the fens at every turn of the moon. Pike, perch, roach, dace, bream. The stream beside the village fed the cottage 6 times a week with small slippery silver bodies that had been alive in its current 10 minutes before. A small hand reached into a wooden bucket and pulled out a perch by the gills, and walked home with it through the grass, and along the stream, In deeper still pools, the village had its own quiet eel trap, a long woven willow basket anchored in the current, mouth upstream, that filled itself overnight and was emptied at dawn. The eels were skinned, salted, hung in the rafters of the cottage with the bacon, and eaten through the long winter. The pigs grunted in the wood. The dog with the clog at his throat watched a wagtail in the yard. The skep on the bank hummed. The hens muttered in the rafters. The cat in the loft yawned. The geese in the yard turned their long necks at a buzzard far overhead. The boy at the stream pulled in a third roach. The afternoon stayed soft, and on the south-facing wall of the cottage, in a little crack between two stones, a swallow had nested in spring and raised 4 young in the long summer. They had flown by the time of our drift, but the small mud cup of the nest was still there, empty and patient, waiting for next year. The medieval village, in a soft and unspoken way, lived inside a much wider weave of small lives than it ever paid attention to. The swallow knew the cottage as well as the cottage knew the swallow. The wagtail in the yard had a name only the children used. The robin in the wood near the well came back to the same low branch every winter, and was fed crumbs by the woman of the next cottage along, who did not have a name for him at all, but who recognized him by sight. And as those small lives drifted on, larger machines, almost invisible in the landscape, kept the village turning, drift now away from the cottage, and out toward the stream that runs along the bottom of the field. The afternoon is moving on. The Hayward has come back from his rounds, and is sitting on a low wall mending a basket. The skeps are humming, and down at the stream the village mill is turning. The wheel goes round, slow and patient and uncomplaining, the way a heart turns over in sleep. We are going to spend a quiet little while with that wheel and what it stands for, because the medieval village near medieval London was, although it does not look like it from the outside, already a place built on machines. It is one of the surprises of the period that by the late 13th century, the small kingdom of England already had something like 10 to 12,000 watermills working on its streams. There was, very roughly, 1 mill for every 2 settlements. Around medieval London, every parish that had a stream had a mill, and several parishes that did not have a stream good enough for a mill had a horse mill or a hand mill instead. The watermill was so woven into the daily landscape of the country that the chroniclers of the time barely thought to mention it. It was simply there, turning, dripping, creaking, pouring meal into a wooden bin, like a tree or a hedge or the bell of the parish church. The mill of our drifting village is small. It has 1 wooden wheel set into the side of a low stone and timber mill house. The wheel is undershot, that is, the water passes underneath it, and the paddles dip in and the current pushes them along. The shaft from the wheel runs into the mill house. Inside, on a thick wooden floor, 2 great round stones lie on top of one another. The bottom one is fixed. The top one, the runner, turns slowly, slowly. Grain pours from a small hopper down into a hole in the top stone. Meal, the fine flour, the rough flour, the bran, slides out around the rim of the lower stone and falls into a bin. The miller, his apron pale with dust, lifts the meal in a wooden scoop. The dust hangs in the slanted afternoon light like a soft, unmoving fog, and the mill is the Lord's. We have said this before. It is worth saying again, because it shaped the lives of the villagers who walked their grain to it. Around medieval London, where most manors were owned by the church, the mill was the bishop's, or the abbey's, or the priory's. To grind your own grain at home, between two small stones in your kitchen, with a hand quern, was a manor court offence in many places. There are surviving records from this very century of villagers being charged a small fine for hiding a hand quern in a back room. The miller's toll, a fixed proportion of every sack the village brought to him, sometimes a 16th, sometimes a 13th, was the Lord's portion. It is one of the slow, soft injustices of the medieval English village that nobody quite called injustice. The grain grew in the Lord's field. It was milled in the Lord's mill. It was baked in the Lord's oven. It came home as bread, but the mill did not only grind grain. By the year 1250, in many of the villages around London, a second kind of mill was beginning to appear, the fulling mill. It was, when you saw it, a very strange thing. A fulling is what happens to woolen cloth after it has been woven, in order to thicken and felt it together. Fresh woven wool is loose and full of grease and dust. To make it warm and weatherproof, the cloth has to be soaked in water and a little fuller's earth, and then beaten, pounded, slapped, hammered for hours until the wool fibers knit together. For most of the centuries before the year 1250, this was done by people, by women mostly, by groups of fullers stamping in low wooden troughs with their bare feet, walking on the wet cloth all day. It was wet, slow, exhausting work. And then, in the late 12th century, somebody had a small clear thought. The wheel of the watermill turning by the stream, the same wheel that lifted the millstones to grind the grain, could, with a different cam, lift heavy wooden hammers instead. 2 hammers, 3 hammers, tall as a man. The hammers were arranged over a low wooden trough. The cloth lay in the trough, soaking. The water turned. The hammers rose and fell, slow and steady day and night, pounding the cloth into thickness without a single pair of human feet getting wet. It does not sound like much, perhaps, in our own century of factories, but it was in its quiet way one of the great softenings of medieval English work. A fulling mill from this very period survives in the records at Alresford in Hampshire, dating to the 13th century. By the time of our drift, fulling mills were spreading along the streams of every wool-growing parish in southern England, and the wool was thickening into the sturdy cloth that would in a few decades become one of the great exports of the kingdom. Which brings us very gently to the wool. The medieval village around London, like every other village in southern England in this century, was carried on the back of the sheep. The wool clip, the spring shearing, was, around 1250, the most valuable thing the country produced. The peak of the great medieval English wool trade was running, almost exactly, from the year of our drift through to the middle of the next century. The years 1250 to 1350 were the era when the cloth on a Florentine merchant's back had very likely been felt at a furlong on an English hill. The greatest flocks were not on small village manors. They were on the great Cistercian abbeys of Yorkshire. The abbey at Rievaulx kept around 14,000 sheep on the moors. The abbey at Fountains, the largest of them all, kept 18,000. Italian merchants, men whose names ended in E and O, men from Florence and Lucca and Genoa, rode up the green roads of England to bid for the wool clip years in advance, sitting at long oak tables in the abbey guest houses, paying in soft Italian gold for English fleeces that had not yet grown. The village around medieval London was not a Yorkshire abbey. Its sheep were fewer, perhaps 100 or 2 on the high heath above the city, perhaps 300 on a good year, but its wool was the same wool. It went eventually to the same fairs. The fleece of the small flock on the abbey's heath above London was sold in late spring at the Bishop's Fair, and from there to the wharves of the city, and from there into the hold of a Flemish ship at the Pool, and from there to the looms of Bruges or Ghent. The thread that came out of the loom in Flanders had been wool on a sheep's back in 1250. The cloth that came back was the same wool, woven, fulled, and shipped home to be sold to a Londoner. The medieval village near London was on this still afternoon already part of a long, quiet machine that reached as far as the Mediterranean, and at the wood's edge, at the far end of the same machine, were the men with the slowest job of all, the charcoal burners. They lived for weeks at a time in low turf shelters at the edge of the forest of Middlesex, or in the great Norwood south of the river. They tended a slow conical mound of stacked oak, smouldering under a covering of earth and leaves, for days, sometimes for a week, never letting it flame, never letting it go out, until the oak inside it had become charcoal, black, light, hard, dense, the cleanest burning fuel that medieval England knew. The charcoal was carried into the city in panniers on the backs of small ponies. The smiths of London, who could not heat their forges hot enough on plain wood, used charcoal. The wax chandlers used charcoal. The bakers of the great London bakehouses used charcoal. The medieval village near London was, in this sense too, the city's quiet servant. Its woods burned slowly, and the city stayed warm. There was another machine, a softer one, at the heart of the village itself, and it was the smith's forge. The forge was almost always at the bend of the lane, set a little apart from the cottages because of the risk of fire. It was a low stone building with a thatched roof and a single great open hearth at the back, and a leather bellows pumped by a boy whose only job all day was to keep the breath of the bellows steady. The smith, broad-armed, leather-aproned, perpetually a little dusted with charcoal, heated his iron in that hearth until it was the colour of the inside of a sunrise, and then carried it on long tongs to the anvil, and rang it into shape with a hammer in slow ringing strokes that the whole village could hear. He made horseshoe nails by the 100. He made the iron rim of a cartwheel. He repaired the iron blade of a plough, which had snapped on a hidden flint in a furrow. He made the small hinges for the manor barn, the latch for the church gate, the iron lid, the couvre-feu for every cottage hearth. The smith was, in many ways, the village's only true industrialist. The slow, steady ring of his hammer was, like the bell of the church and the turn of the mill wheel, one of the 4 or 5 recognizable sounds of the medieval English village. And between the village and the city, holding the whole small economy together, was the road. We picture medieval roads as muddy ruts. Some of them were, but many of them were the old Roman roads, more than 1,000 years old already in 1250, still running straight and stone-paved across the English countryside, weathered, narrowed, but unmistakably engineered. Around medieval London, several of these Roman roads still came into the city. The great road from the north that we now call Ermina Street, the road from Colchester in the east, the road from Dover and the south coast, the road from the west towards Silchester. Smaller tracks led off them to every village, and small wooden bridges crossed every stream. The villager going to the city on a market morning did not, on most days, struggle through mud. He walked along a road that was older than his church, and at the end of that road, at the city gate, very early in the morning of a market day, the village's small produce was unloaded. A basket of eggs, a pat of butter, a cheese wrapped in leaves, a small pannier of fleeces, 6 capons in a wicker cage. The villager handed them to a city storekeeper, took a few small silver pennies in his palm, bought what he had come to buy, a strip of leather, a small iron tool, a ribbon for his wife, and walked back home along the same Roman stone, all in the space of a single morning. The water wheel of our village mill turns, and turns, and turns. The hammers of the fulling mill in the next parish over fall and rise. The shears of the sheep shearer on the heath above click and click, and in the wood the charcoal mound smoulders, and in the forge at the bend of the lane the slow steady ring of the smith's hammer rises and falls, almost in time with the bell. And while the mill turned and the cloth shrank under its hammers, an older, quieter engine kept time inside the cottage walls. Step back now, very gently, out of the wood and away from the mill. The afternoon has slipped. The light is the color of pale honey on the field. The villagers are turning home, and let us go inside properly with one of them. Let us walk through the wooden door of a single thatched cottage into the long quiet room where almost the whole of a medieval life happened. We will spend the chapter here. There is no hurry. The cottage is built around a frame of oak. 2 pairs of curved oak timbers, set in mirror image, lean inwards from the ground and meet at the apex of the roof. They look almost like the legs of a 4-legged animal kneeling, or like the letter A drawn twice in the air. They are called crux. Each pair was felled perhaps 30 years ago, perhaps 50, from a single bent oak in the wood. The 2 halves of the crux come from the same tree, split lengthways, so that the 2 curves match. The crux frame is the bones of the cottage. Everything else is hung on it. The walls between the crux are wattle and daub. The wattle is the woven part, long thin twigs of hazel or willow or cleft oak, woven horizontally between upright stakes set into the ground, like a long flat basket pressed sideways. The daub is the smear over it, a thick mud of clay and chopped straw and dung, sometimes a little chalk or lime if the village could afford it. It is laid on by hand, both sides, an inch thick, then smoothed with a wooden trowel. When it dries, it is hard, soft-edged, and pleasantly warm in the cold. When it is hit by hard rain, it slowly returns to mud, and the village patches it again. Wattle and daub is not a permanent thing. Wattle and daub is a thing maintained every season like the field. Above the walls, the thatch, long bundles of dry rye straw or wheat straw, sometimes reed if the parish was near a marsh, were tied in tight handfuls and pegged onto a frame of light wooden battens. The thatch was laid thick, perhaps 18 inches deep, perhaps 2 feet. It shed rain, it held warmth, it harbored sparrows and mice, and once or twice in a generation it caught fire. The straw came from the autumn harvest, after the first frosts had made the stalks brittle and ready to be cut. The roof has, somewhere near the center, a single small opening. The smoke from the hearth rises slowly into the steep dim space under the thatch and finds its way out through that hole. There is no chimney, there never was. A medieval cottage smelled, all the time, very gently of wood smoke. The beams were dark with it. The thatch underside was dark with it. Your hair smelled faintly of wood smoke for your whole life. You did not notice it. The room itself is one room. It is long. It runs from a door at one short end to another door at the other short end, sometimes the same door, sometimes two opposite each other, so that the wind can be channeled through to winnow the grain in autumn. At one end the family lives. There is the hearth in the middle of the floor. There is a low wooden bench against the wall. There is a small chest, sometimes carved, holding the linen and the few coins and the parish deed. There is a wooden bed, perhaps 2, sometimes more a low platform than a bed, covered in straw and a rough woolen blanket. There is a small shelf above the door. There is the cooking pot. There is the wooden ladle. At the other end, in many of the villages further west of London, and in some of the smaller cottages around the city itself, the cattle live behind a wooden screen, sometimes only an arm's length high, sometimes a full partition. The byre opens onto a second door. The cow stands tethered at her manger. A drainage channel runs down the center of the byre floor and out under the wall. The whole arrangement is called a longhouse, and it is one of the most surprising things to a modern listener about the medieval English village. A 13th century example, beautifully preserved by archaeology, sits at Hound Tor in Devon, a long thatched stone cottage, 14 meters long and 4 meters wide, with a clear human living area at one end and a stone-paved cattle area at the other, and the drainage channel still visible down the middle of the cattle floor. The Hound Tor Longhouse was, in plan, exactly the same idea you find in our drifting village around London, though here on the bishop's land or the abbey's land, the building tends to be lighter, a little smaller, a little more often cob and thatch than stone. The principle is the same. The animals lived in many cottages only an arm's reach from the bed. Their warm bodies kept the building warm at night. Their breath, slow and steady, was almost a sound of the room. It is a strange, soft thing to picture in a modern bedroom, to lie down to sleep in winter, while a cow chews her cud through the wooden screen. But for the medieval villager, that breath was simply a part of the night, like the hens in the rafters, like the dog at the door, like the cricket somewhere behind the chest. The light in the cottage at evening was a single small thing. It was a rushlight. Take a tall wild rush from the bank by the stream, strip away its outer green skin almost entirely, leaving only a thin spine to hold the soft inner pith. Soak the pith in melted mutton fat, again and again, until it is heavy with it. Dry it. Set one end into a small iron pinch, a rushlight holder, that grips it like a finger. Hold a small flame to the soaked end. It catches. It burns slowly with a tiny clear flame, and in the dim cottage that flame is enough to see a face by, enough to find a child by, enough to mend a sock by. Each rushlight burns for about half an hour. The medieval cottage measured its evenings in rushlights. 2 rushlights was the time it took to mend a leather strap. 3 rushlights was a long winter conversation. 4 rushlights was a sick child. The peasant household did not have many words for time, but it had rushlights. The wealthier could have a tallow candle, a wick of woven flax dipped in molten beef or mutton fat. It gave a little more light, lasted longer, smoked more, smelled of fat. The villager did not ordinarily light tallow at home. Tallow was for the manor hall. The truly fine light, the light of beeswax, was almost never burned in a peasant cottage. Beeswax was the pure, clean, golden, almost smokeless light of the rich and the parish church. We will return to the church properly in a little while, but it is worth holding now this small fact, because it changes how a modern listener sees the place. The parish church of a medieval English village spent a remarkable proportion of its annual budget on candles. Beeswax in many parishes was the second most expensive thing the church bought every year, after the maintenance of the bell rope and the patching of the roof. In some accounts, fully half, of the running cost of the chapel was wax. The bees on the bank behind the cottages, the small skeps of the village, were producing the light that on Sunday morning lifted the chapel out of dimness. The candle on the altar was, in a quiet sense, the village's own. The bedding in the cottage is simple. Most of the household sleeps on the same wooden benches that line the long wall, the same benches they have been sitting on all day. The benches are narrow, perhaps 2 feet across, low to the ground, made of 2 great oak planks, resting on rough trestles. Over the planks, a thick mattress of straw stuffed into a coarse linen cover. Over the mattress, a sheet of unbleached linen if the household is doing well, or no sheet at all if it is not. Over that, a heavy woolen blanket, almost certainly grey or undyed brown, made of the village's own wool, woven on the loom at the back of the cottage. Sometimes a fur of rabbit or sheep over the blanket. In winter, the pillow, if there is a pillow, is a small bag of feathers from the goose at Michaelmas, or simply a folded cloak under the head. A wealthier cottage might have an actual bed frame at the warm end of the room, a low wooden box of 4 planks lashed together at the corners, with a straw mattress laid inside. The wealthiest of all, the priests, the smiths, the bailiffs, might have a curtained box bed, a kind of small wooden cupboard with sliding panels you could close around yourself for warmth and privacy on the coldest nights of the year. The box bed was the closest thing the medieval village had to a private room. It was not a bedroom. It was a little wooden room inside a room. The one chest in the cottage holds the household's most valuable things: the pair of linen sheets, the wedding cloak, a small bag of silver pennies, a year's earnings beyond what was paid in kind, the copy of the manor's customal if the household happens to hold it, a wooden cup that came from a great-grandmother, a small carved comb, a folded length of dyed wool that was bought 2 years ago at the city fair and is being saved for a daughter's wedding gown. The chest is bound in iron and locked with a great clumsy iron key that hangs on a leather thong from the goodwife's belt. On the wall above the bench hangs the household's loom. The medieval English cottage loom was a vertical, warp-weighted thing, a tall wooden frame leaning slightly back against the wall, with a horizontal beam at the top from which dozens of long warp threads hung downward, each weighted at the bottom by a small fired clay weight. The weights kept the threads taut. The weaver, almost always the woman of the house, passed the weft thread between them on a wooden shuttle, then pressed it up against the previous row with a comb. A piece of cloth grew very slowly from the top of the loom downwards. A blanket might take a winter to weave, a cloak 2 winters. The loom was, in many cottages, almost a piece of furniture, leaning quietly against the wall when not in use, and the slow, soft thump-thump of the comb pressing the weft was, on long evenings, one of the rhythms of the room. Back in the cottage, the rushlight flickers in the iron pinch on the wall. Above the wooden door, on a small shelf, sits a small wooden saint. It is a rough carving, perhaps the work of a wandering woodcarver who came through the village 2 summers ago, or perhaps the work of the goodman's grandfather. It is the patron saint of the parish. It might be St. Dunstan, if the village were Stepney. It might be St. Giles, if the village were Camberwell. It might be the Virgin, with her small carved child on her arm. It is painted in colours faded by wood smoke. The household crosses itself, with a small private gesture of the right hand to the brow and the breast and the shoulders, every time it passes beneath that shelf in the dark. The wooden saint watches the room. The wooden saint has, in a sense, watched it for a long time, and before the family settles, the good wife says, quietly, without ceremony, almost to herself, the small evening prayer that everyone in the village knew by heart, the Lord's Prayer in Latin, the Pater Noster, learned by the ear from the priest at Sunday Mass, the Hail Mary, the Ave, a short charm to keep the cottage from fire and the cattle from sickness. The children, if they are still awake, mumble the words after her. Then they roll onto their benches. Then the rushlight flickers and flickers and flickers and is very nearly out. And in the soft dim circle of that single rush, with the saint's painted face barely visible above the door, the long evening at last began to slow. The light has gone now. The last gold has slipped off the upper edge of the thatch. The sky over the village around medieval London is the deep blue of a glaze fired only once before it has fully turned. Inside the cottage, the rushlight is still burning. A woman is folding a small piece of grey-brown wool into a chest. A boy is stooped at the hearth, banking the fire down into a quieter shape. A cow shifts in the byre. The night, which has been gathering itself all afternoon, has come at last. Let us walk very gently one last time across the village before everyone goes to their bench. Let us look in at the parish church, on the small rise where the church stood. The door is heavy oak, banded in iron. It is unlocked. In the medieval English village, the door of the church was almost never locked. A villager in trouble could go in to pray at any hour, and a villager seeking sanctuary could claim it at the altar. The door swings open. Inside, the air is cold and smells of stone and old beeswax. The building is small, a low nave with a roof of dark oak beams, a short chancel beyond a stone arch, a single bell tower at the west end with a single bell. There are no pews. There are not yet pews. The villagers stood for mass or knelt on the rush-strewn floor, except for the very old, who sat on a stone bench around the inside wall. There is a small rough font near the door for baptisms. There is a stone altar at the east end, beneath a small lancet window with a piece of greenish glass. The walls are not bare. The walls are painted. Medieval parish churches around London in the year 1250 were almost never bare stone. They were covered, ceiling to floor, in wall paintings. They were painted in red and yellow ochre and pale green and lamp black, and the paintings showed the lives of the saints, the parable of the prodigal son, the journey of the three magi, the nativity, the crucifixion. They were the church's books for a parish that could not read books. The villagers did not enter a building of gentle dim stone. They entered a building covered in pictures, and above the chancel arch, painted in a great wide sweeping band, the place where everyone's eye fell as they faced the altar, was the doom, the last judgment. The doom painting was a fixed feature of the English parish church through almost the whole of the Middle Ages. It showed Christ, seated on a rainbow judging souls. On his right, the saved drifted upwards toward a small painted heaven. On his left, the damned were dragged downwards into a hell mouth, a great open jaw of a beast, with smaller devils pulling figures inside by their hair, by their hands, by their feet. The doom was the closest thing a 13th century villager had to a film. He did not need to read. He could read a hellmouth. A particularly early surviving English doom painting is at Chaldon, in Surrey, dating to about the year 1200, only 50 years before our drifting night. It is a kind of ladder of souls, painted in pale red on the west wall of the nave, with figures climbing rungs and demons pulling them off. The villagers of Chaldon walked under it every Sunday. The villagers of every parish around medieval London walked under something like it every Sunday. Whatever they thought of it, and we will never quite know what they thought of it, it sat in the back of the eye, all the small days of their lives. There is one more soft surprise about the medieval village's calendar that is worth carrying into sleep. We picture the medieval villager as a person who worked every day, dawn to dusk, year after year, and rested only at Christmas. It was not so. The medieval church year, around the year 1250, contained between 40 and 50 saints' days that were festa ferienda, work forbidden, added to every Sunday. That is a villager who, in the course of a year, did not work on something close to 100 days. The 13th century English peasant, in this respect, had more days off than many a modern weekday worker. The days were not, on the whole, days of leisure in the modern sense. They were days for mass, for procession, for ale feasts on the green, for a shared meal at the manor hall, but they were not days at the plough. The greatest of these were, of course, the great feasts, Christmas and Easter and Whitsun, but there were many smaller ones. The feast of the patron saint of your own parish was always a holiday in your village. The feast of the patron of your neighbour's parish was a holiday only in his. So the year had a kind of quiet rolling pattern of work and rest, much more textured than a modern calendar. And in late spring, just before Ascension, came Rogacantide, the 3 days of the Rogacantion. On those mornings the priest, with the cross-bearer and the parish boys, walked the entire boundary of the parish, round every hedge, along every ditch, beside every stream, beside every finger-post, chanting psalms and blessing the fields for the harvest. The boys were taught the bounds of the parish by walking them at a young age. By the late Middle Ages it became a custom, gentle in some places, less gentle in others, to mark the bounds in their memory by lightly tapping them against the hedge or the boundary stone, a small thump to be remembered. The medieval village around London knew exactly where it ended. Its children knew. They had walked it, side by side with the priest and the cross, every spring since they were 6. Now walk back, very softly, out of the church. Close the heavy oak door behind you. Stand for a moment in the small graveyard. The slate stones lean in the long grass. The yew tree at the corner has been there since long before any of these villagers were born. The bell of the parish gives a single low, slow stroke. The villagers, in their cottages, look up. It is the curfew bell. In every cottage in the village, a hand reaches out and lifts the iron lid, the couvre-feu, the cover-fire, the lid that William the Conqueror had ordered into law 250 years ago, and sets it gently down over the embers on the hearth. The fire is not put out. The fire is banked. The embers will keep their slow heat all night under the iron, and tomorrow morning, before dawn, the woman of the house will lift the lid again and feed a single dry stick into a still warm coal, and the day will start. The cottage, all the same, has just become darker. Only the rushlight on its wall still gives a small clear flame. The cattle in the byre lie down. The hens in the rafters tuck their heads under their wings. The dog at the door turns 3 slow circles and sinks down into the straw with a sigh. The boy who was tending the hearth rolls onto his bench and pulls the blanket to his chin. The woman of the house pinches the rushlight between damp fingers. There is a small hiss. The room is dark. The cottage smells of damp wool and wood smoke and the warm body of the cow. There were stories before the rushlight finally went out. There almost always were. The medieval English winter evening, in a cottage with no books and no glass and no clock, was a place built for stories. The grandmother in her shawl by the bench told the children of the year of the great frost, when the river had frozen so hard the city carts had crossed it. The good man told again the story of how his uncle had walked all the way to Canterbury at the time of the great pilgrimage, and what he had seen on the road, and what he had brought back. The boy of 15 told a half-mended story he had heard from a wandering minstrel about Robin in the green wood, or about Sir Bevis of Hampton, or about the giant slain by a small knight on a hill in the West Country. None of these stories was written down. The medieval village around London had, in the year 1250, almost no books at all. Perhaps a small psalter in the priest's house, perhaps a parchment customal in the Lord's strong-box, and perhaps a single illustrated almanac in the abbey's gatehouse. Beyond those, the village's whole memory lived in voices, in the slow nightly retelling, by lamplight, of stories the grandmother had heard from her grandmother. It is a different shape of memory. It is loose. It is plural. It changes a little every winter, but it is alive in a way that perhaps no book quite is. The medieval villager, drifting towards sleep on his bench under his woolen blanket, was almost certainly drifting under the soft last words of a story. And outside, in the small, still graveyard, the slate stones leaned in the long grass. The yew tree by the corner, already 200 years old in 1250, perhaps 300, perhaps more, held its dark green needles against the deeper dark of the sky. The bell rope of the church hung still in its little wooden chamber, waiting for the morning. The fox at the wood's edge, who had not dared come closer while the curfew bell was still ringing, stepped now very softly out into the lane, and crossed it, and was gone again into the shadow on the other side. The owl in the barn turned her head at the small click of his paws, and went on watching the field. In the abbey upstream, in the small chapter house where the monks had said their last office of the day, a single beeswax candle was being pinched out by the sacristan's fingers. In the bishop's small palace just inside the city wall, a clerk was banking a coal fire and going to his own bed. In the cathedral on its hill, the great bell was already silent. The whole long narrative, village and abbey and city, was, at last, drifting toward the same single quiet sleep. Outside, the village is very quiet. The only sound is the wind in the great oak by the church, and far away, very far away, almost too soft to hear, the very last bell of the city. A small wind moved in the great oak by the church, and went on. A single cow in a far cottage lowed once at nothing in particular, and was answered by a cow in the next cottage, and the two of them fell silent together. The owl in the barn shifted on her perch. The fox on the wood edge, who had been hunting the long way round the village, paused for a moment by the corner of the tithe barn, then ran on. Somewhere overhead a star slid quietly behind the slow grey edge of a passing cloud, and so as the embers settled and the village around London grew quieter still, and so the night has folded itself very softly around the village around medieval London. The embers are banked, the cattle have lain down, the boy has rolled onto his bench, the woman has pinched out the rushlight between her fingers, and the small hiss of it has gone, and the cottage is dark. Outside, the lane is empty. The yew tree at the corner of the churchyard is barely darker than the sky behind it. The hen in the rafters has tucked her head. The dog at the door has sighed. Let the night settle on you a little, the way it has settled on the village. There is no need to do anything. There is no need to remember anything. There is no thread that needs to be picked up tomorrow. The fields are taking care of themselves. The pottage pot is cold. The reeve has gone home. The haywood has gone home. The priest is asleep in his small cottage beside the church. The mill at the bottom of the field has stopped turning because the miller has shut the sluice and the water runs past instead of under the wheel. Even the great forest of Middlesex, north of the city, has gone quiet. Only the distant bell of the city, very faint now, very gentle, says one last small note before it too falls silent. Drift back, if you wish, through the day we walked through. The morning bell over the hayfields, the haywood mending a gap in a hedge, the strips of the open field ribboned through the parish, the alewife with her ash pole over her door, the pottage at the back of the hearth, the dough coming home warm from the Lord's oven, the pigs in the wood eating the year's acorns, the children with their sacks of dead wood, the dog at the threshold with the small wooden clog, the bees on the bank humming, the mill on the stream, the hammers of the fulling mill, the charcoal burner tending his slow mound, the crock frame inside the cottage, the buyer at the long end of the room, the rushlight burning for half an hour, the wooden saint above the door, the doom painting on the chancel arch, the roguish and tide procession, the curfew bell, the iron lid set down over the embers. Let each of these things, one by one, fade a little. Let the morning bell go quiet. Let the strips of the field grow soft. Let the bees on the bank be still. Let the mill stop. Let the rushlight go out. Let the wooden saint settle into his shelf. Let the doom painting fade into the dark. Let the embers cool slowly under the iron lid. Nothing of this needs to follow you out of the night. The village around London is taking care of all of it. The village has been taking care of all of it for hundreds of years before this evening, and will go on taking care of it for hundreds of years after. You and I were only listening for a little while. Let your shoulders soften, just a little more. Let your hands open in your lap or at your side. Let your jaw fall gently. Feel how the pillow takes the small weight of your head. Feel the slow, easy pull of your own breath, in and then out. The breath does not need any help from you tonight. It knows what to do. There is nothing more for you to carry. There is nothing more for you to settle. The bell of the city is gone. The fire is banked. The cottage is warm. Close your eyes. Let the night come closer. Let your breath slow. Let the village fade. Let the lamp fade. Let the bell fade. There is nothing pulling you forward now. There is nothing left to hold. Only the slow, soft dark, and a long, quiet rest. Sleep well.